Welcome back to another Python tutorial. All right, so we are going to be covering, albeit briefly, a Python library that I built that we're going to be leveraging inside of our series where we start exploring some of the services that are found inside of Microsoft Azure. Now, the specific library that we're going to be covering in this instance is the Financial News Aggregator. And so this was actually, it's kind of interesting. I never really planned to make this library, but I was doing a little bit of research one day and I began to realize that basically all of the major news companies that, well, really just all of the major news companies in general, a lot of them have an RSS feed that we can publicly access for free to grab some of the headlines for that particular day on different topics. So I said, well, this is great. This is a wonderful amount of data, and I really would like to access it. But what I really wanted to do was make sure we standardize how we interacted with those news services. And so that's what this library is intended to do. It's supposed to make it where you have one entry point to access all the different news aggregators, or sorry, not news aggregators, all the news sources, and grab different articles that relate to different topics. So a lot of you will probably look at this video and go, wow, this is pretty straightforward. It seems, hopefully, well, at least that's the goal, at least is hopefully it's straightforward, but it's not really a super complicated library to use. And that's simply just because the functionality is really just grabbing articles. So there's nothing really beyond that. But it's important because we're going to be leveraging this particular library in our series for Microsoft Azure. Now, this library is hosted on PyPy, so you are allowed to go and install it locally. In fact, I would recommend you do that just because it's going to make your life easier. So if you do want to install this library, it's going to be pip install FinNews. So if you were inside of Visual Studio Code, it would be pip install FinNews. Now, I've already installed it on my system, so it's already telling me that the requirements have been satisfied. But after you run that command, you should be able to use the library inside of your Python projects. Now, what we're going to do here is we're really going to just create a simple file and talk through some of the logic about how you would interact with this particular module and how would you go and get some topics related to different things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new Python file. And if you plan to clone this particular GitHub repo to your system, then I would recommend that you put this file in the samples folder. So inside of here, I'm going to right click, do new file, and we'll call this one use news client.py. Okay, and then from here, it's a pretty straightforward process when it comes to interacting with the client. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say from finnews.client import the news object. Now this really represents the news client. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new instance of that news client. So create a new instance of the news client. This is really your main entry point into the other news sources. So now I think that's also important to note at this point. You don't technically have to go through that main news client, but I would recommend it simply because unless you plan to do only a specific news service, then unfortunately what you would have to do is you would have to import each individual news client. Now, in most situations, you're probably going to want to work with more than just one. So I would recommend you access all of those clients through the main news client. So we'll say news client equals new instance of news. And then from here, it's pretty straightforward. So you just basically have to first determine which news source do you want. So say, for example, I want CNBC. So grab the CNBC news client. Then I would create a new variable called CNBC client. And then from here, I would take my main news client, and then you'll notice there's a bunch of attributes that represent the other news sources and their respective client objects. So in this case, if I want CNBC, I would just use the CNBC attribute. And then from here, I now have an instance of the CNBC client. So if I want, I can take my CNBC client and I can basically specify what news feeds I want. Now, depending on the news source that you're going to be working with, how you interact with this specific client might be slightly different. I will say CNBC tends to be the most unique. Beyond CNBC, I would say almost all the other ones, it's a pretty standard way of interacting with it. CNBC is a little bit different, and that's simply because when you tap into a feed, they'll ask you for a topic ID. And so because of that, you need to make sure you pass through that topic ID. Now, I'm going to show you how to do that. Nice thing is I did try to document as best I could the different ways. So if you actually look over the doc strings, you'll see examples on how to use the individual feeds. So you can see here, the investing feeds has a topic, and that topic can be investing. So say here, I want to do investing's feed, and I would do a topic, and I would say investing. You can see here, this is a little bit easier to read, but you can kind of see what's going on. So if you do have a specific question like, well, what are the topics that I can use? Well, then I would recommend that you go to the fields.py file, and you'll notice here, I basically have a bunch of dictionaries that make it easy to interact with. Now, this is the dictionary ones. I also have an enumeration one where you can actually import the specific enumeration, and then you can talk about the different topics. So here you can see I could also use the CNBC investing. So if you wanted to do it like this, you would say from FinNews client, FinNews news enum, and then you would say CNBC, of course, as I'm jumping ahead, CNBC investing. So this would create that particular one. And so say I wanted to do the same thing here, no worries. It would be CNBC client, investing feed, and then it would be topic equals CNBC investing. And then I would use the investing topic as well. So this is just another way of doing it. Just for diversity's sake, we're going to do different ones so you can see what that would look like. And so I would say grab all the investing articles. So we'll say investing articles. And then here, grab all the personal finance articles. And then we'll just do this one, personal finance articles. Now, what we're going to do after this is we're going to print out this content just so it's a little bit easier to read. It does come back in a dictionary, so I would recommend that you import pretty print. And so we're going to say import pretty print, just again for readability. So we're going to say pretty print, investing articles. Let's see what we get with this one. Hopefully no errors. Perfect. So you can clearly see that it comes back with a bunch of different content. Content that it does come back with will vary a little bit, obviously, depending on the news source. So some news sources are a little bit more generous than others. And then also you'll find different topics can be a little bit more generous than other ones. So don't be surprised if you go into one topic, you have a bunch of stuff, you go into another topic, you don't have as much. However, I will say that most of the news sources, at least along their respective feeds, they tend to be relatively consistent. Very rarely will you see discrepancies. When you do, it tends to be a very specific key, something like an article author or something like that. In those situations, you might see something a little bit differently. Now, because some of this content can just be large in nature, there's just a lot of different content here, I have done my best to give you examples of what each of the feeds look like in JSON files. So I'm not 100% positive this is every news feed, but I tried to do as much as I could so that way you could see what the output would look like. This is going to be very helpful when we go to our Microsoft Azure series, because this is going to serve as our basis when it comes to creating tables and trying to build in the logic to make it dynamic based on the news source. So you can see here, this is what CNBC would look like. This is what CNN Finance would look like. Now, keep in mind, you notice how when I jump between them, sometimes they'll have different keys. Again, they're relatively consistent, but don't be surprised if you do see some discrepancies. It really does depend on the topic at hand. You have Market Watch, you have NASDAQ, you have Seeking Alpha, you have SP Global or S&P Global, you have Wall Street Journal, and you have Yahoo Finance. I am planning to put in the Economic Times. I think that's the one that I was thinking of. So I'm planning to put that one in there. Reuters, I'm planning on potentially doing that one as well. I think that's it. I think Bloomberg had one at some point, but I don't know if I was ever able to get that one to work. So I don't know if I'm going to have Bloomberg in there. But I do plan to have maybe three more news sources in here, just again to add some diversity to it. But really, this would be the same process when it comes to interacting with the different news sources. Now, the nice thing is, if you do plan to save this content to a file, I tried to make it really easy for everyone by adding that functionality into the news client main ones. Now, I do want to warn you, I was very explicit here. This one will save it, but it's going to save it to this particular responses folder. So just be a little bit aware of that. I will probably change it at some point to make it a little bit more dynamic, but you can clearly see here that this one would save it to a very specific location. So I would recommend for the time being, don't use it, but know it's there. And at some point I will make it a little bit more general. So if you wanted to, it would be content, and then we'll say personal finance articles. It would be the file name. In this case, I would say CNBC test dot, what is it? We'll just do CNBC test. I can't remember if I put the, yeah. So then it would look basically something like this. And then what we'll see is there will now be an in here, and then it's nice and formatted for you as well. So that way you're not looking at a bunch of blob of information that's you can't even read. But that's using the CNBC one. If you want, you could also do some other news sources as well. So let's say grab the, what is it? S&P Global News Client, and we'll say SP Global Client equals News Client, and then we'll do SP Global, and then what is it? SP Global Client, all indices. So this is kind of a nice one. Corporate news, education, methodologies, market commentary. So they actually have a lot of good information in here. I haven't had enough time to look through everything, but I will say there's definitely some stuff in here that would probably be worth looking at. So I would definitely recommend, if you get a chance, do a little bit of digging in it to see what you could get. And then we'll say research articles. There we go. Then we'll say grab the research articles. And I'm going to comment that out. And then I'm going to say pretty print research articles. And let's see what that gives us. Perfect. So it looks good. And then again, we could go through each one, but I'm just going to tell you now, it's exactly the same thing. So it's really just grabbing the specific client and then specifying the newsfeed. If you are at any point confused or you're not necessarily sure what feeds exist for which client, I would recommend that you take a look at the individual sample files, so that way you can get a general idea of how to interact with each of the clients. I try to do my best to give you each feed and just give you different topics and really show you how to use them. And then in some cases, even show you how to save it to a particular file. Again, here is CNN Finance, Market Watch, NASDAQ, S&P Global, Seeking Alpha, Wall Street Journal, and then Yahoo Finance. So again, If you're confused at any point, I would redirect you to these files. Otherwise, that really does it for this particular series. I just wanted to do a brief overview of getting you up and running, getting you familiar with the general feel of how to use the library, with the intent of using it in our next series, where we're going to start exploring some topics within Microsoft Azure, which will be coming soon. So if you have any questions at this point, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we will see you in our next series.